Station Chaplain, Chaplain Colonel Michael Jeffries.
Unit, attend, who? Present, who?
I invite you to join me in prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we ask your blessing upon today's ceremony. We come together this morning to honor Sergeant William Henry Johnson. This post exists to train our sons and daughters to win in combat, to defend our nation from those who would threaten our freedoms and our liberties. We refer to our mission as forging the warrior spirit. Sergeant Johnson put his mission first, never quit, never accepted defeat, and never left a fallen comrade. His story is one of a U.S. Army soldier who possessed the warrior spirit. We honor him today in recognition of all that he gave to our nation and all that he gave defending and fighting to protect those on the battlefield around him. May this be a day that brings us together in unity around our common oath to support and defend our Constitution of the United States and inspire us to live up to the challenges of living out the warrior ethos and the warrior spirit, not for vainglory, but for the preservations of our nation's ideals and for the protections of the freedoms and liberties fought for by men and women like Sergeant Johnson. We have been given a sacred trust. Strengthen us well to fight to win, strengthen our soul to honor the legacy of sacrifice by others. God bless the United States of America and the men and women who answered the call to defend her. Amen.
Please be seated. Among our distinguished guests for today's ceremony are General Daniel P. and Mrs. Hokinson, Command Sergeant Major Retired Lewis and Teresa Wilson, Mrs. Tara Johnson and family, Ms. Marina Walker Howe, Mrs. Wallace Howe Rosenzweig. From the Naming Commission, Admiral Retired Michelle Howard, Mr. Jared Buchanan, Lieutenant General Retired Thomas Bostic, Mayor Keith Louie, Mayor Carolyn Todd, Mayor Christy Clayton, Mayor Donna Duvall, Ms. Lee Turner, representing Senator Cassidy, Ms. Whitney Lambright, representing Congressman Mike Johnson, Mr. Woody Daigle, representing Senator Kennedy, Secretary Don Pearson, Louisiana Economic Development, Brigadier General Isabel Smith, Commanding General, 42nd Infantry Division, New York National Guard, Brigadier General Nathan Lord, Deputy Commander for Support, 42nd Infantry Division, New York National Guard, Brigadier General Thomas Freelou, Louisiana National Guard, Director of Joint Staff, Command Sergeant Major Sud Robertson, Louisiana National Guard, Brigadier General April Hampton, Louisiana National Guard, Director, Joint Staff, Mr. Brandon Owens, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Energy, Installations, and Environment. The Commander of Troops for today's redesignation ceremony is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Tepke, the Deputy Commander and Chief of Staff of the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Polk. The The ceremony will begin when the commander of troops commands the units to attention.
Units, attend. Who?
In front of you today are the unit colors and the command teams of Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Polk. The soldiers standing before you on the field represent the major subordinate commands of the installation. From your left, they are the United States Army Garrison, commanded by Colonel Samuel Smith and Command Sergeant Major Stephen Nielsen. The Joint Readiness Training Center Operations Group, led by Major Linwood Buvar, commanded by Colonel Matthew Hardman and Command Sergeant Major Michael Hall. The 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Childers, commanded by Colonel Ryan Barnett and Command Sergeant Major Stephen Siglock. The United States Army Medical Department Activity, commanded by Colonel Alyssa Wilma and Command Sergeant Major Shavonda Devereaux. The 32nd Hospital Center, led by Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Baronanello, commanded by Colonel Rose Freeman and Command Sergeant Major Jonathan Graves. The colors are cased as the unit is currently forward deployed in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. The colors are comprised of soldiers of Operation Group led by the Post Command Sergeant Major David Hanson. The United States Army Dental Health Activity, commanded by Colonel Ann Behrens and Sergeant First Class Sergio Guerrero Sanchez. The 1st Battalion, 5th Aviation Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Polk and Command Sergeant Major Jack Essig. The 519th Military Police Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Murphy and Command Sergeant Major David Bakken. The 46th Engineer Battalion, led by Major Taylor Oney, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sean Woodard and Command Sergeant Major Susan Fernandez. The 3rd Battalion, 353rd Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Arthurs and Master Sergeant James Skelton. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the posting of the colors and honors to the nation. The national anthem will be performed by the 36th Infantry Division Band of the Texas Army National Guard.
Enter. March. Forward. March. March.
your attention to the anvil on the field. Brigadier General Gardner, General Hokanson, Command Sergeant Major Hanson, Command Sergeant Major Retired Wilson, and Staff Sergeant Garrett Paulson, the 2022 Department of the Army Non-Commissioned Officer of the Year, will now initiate the redesignation of Fort Polk to Fort Johnson with a single blow to the anvil. This act will ensure the tradition of forging the warrior spirit carries on for generations to come, that train and prepare for combat at the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Johnson. Will Mrs. Tara Johnson and Wallace Howell Rosensweig please stand as their families work tirelessly for Sergeant William Henry Johnson to receive recognition. They will now lead us in the countdown from 5 for the striking of the anvil and the raising of the Fort Johnson banner by the Sergeant Artie Murphy Club, Bayou Chapter, and the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division, Best Squad.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the video monitors on your left and right as we read the official order for the redesignation to Fort Johnson. Effective 13 June 2023, Fort Polk is redesignated as Fort Johnson in accordance with Section 370 of the William M. Thornberry National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021. Signed, the Honorable Christine E. Wormuth, Secretary of the Army. At this time, Brigadier General David W. Gardner and Post Command Sergeant Major David P. Hanson will join Colonel Smith and Command Sergeant Major Nielsen as they unveil the United States Army Garrison Fort Johnson colors. This is the final act and completes the redesignation of Fort Polk to Fort Johnson.
Unveil. Come.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, General Daniel R. Wilkinson.
Good morning. It's an honor to join you here today to both commemorate a new chapter of Fort Johnson and celebrate its legacy of military excellence. I'd like to thank Brigadier General Gardner for his gracious hospitality in welcoming all of us here. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to take an aerial tour, and as we passed over the fields, trees, and ranges below, I was struck by the transformative power of this place. Well, that and the humidity. But in all seriousness, Fort Johnson is the home of the Joint Readiness Training Center, the fire where warriors are formed, warriors like William Henry Johnson. Here is where combat readiness and capacity harden our fighting forces. Here is where we prepare ourselves to fulfill the oath we made to support and defend our Constitution, no matter where that takes us or no matter what our nation asks us to do. In our profession of arms, we don't often stop to think about what that means. We just see it as doing our jobs. But looking back at the fearless heroism of Sergeant William Henry Johnson, the 369th Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard, better remembered as the Harlem Hellfighters, and the National Guard's groundbreaking contributions during the First World War, I'm again reminded and inspired by what it means to serve and what it means to be a citizen soldier. You see, World War I transformed the National Guard. It was no longer a collection of local militias. It was a professional military force. For the first time, it was officially called the National Guard. In World War I, the entire National Guard, a total of 17 divisions, was drafted into the service of the United States Army. Disciplined, trained, courageous, they fought alongside both active duty soldiers and our foreign partners. They displayed exemplary valor and relentless endurance and helped the Allies secure victory in the war to end all wars. But we now know that was not the end of combat, nor was it the end of the National Guard's significance. A short 23 years later, the Army established this site for the Louisiana maneuvers and to prepare soldiers to again fight overseas in a great battle for the future of the world. We do not seek war, but we seek to win it. That is why we train here. It is as simple and serious as that. Today, as in 1918, as in the first Massachusetts muster in 1636, that is the purpose of the National Guard. We exist to fight and win our nation's wars. At pivotal moments in history, at pivotal moments in battle, there are guardsmen who stepped away from being a citizen to be a soldier. They train, they fight, they fulfill their oath. They are warriors. They are heroes. And that is why I'm proud this place, home of heroes, forging the warrior spirit, bears the name of a guardsman, Sergeant William Henry Johnson. I'd like to thank the Naming Commission for commemorating Sergeant Johnson's courage, strength, and readiness, and recognizing the historic contributions of the citizen soldiers he embodied. I'd particularly like to recognize the members of the Naming Commission here with us today. Admiral Retired Michelle Howard, Lieutenant General Retired Thomas Bostic, and Mr. Jerry Buchanan. Fort Johnson is named after a citizen and a soldier, and it is a tribute to both his personal heroism and the sacrifices made by so many to defend freedom. This is the legacy of Sergeant William Henry Johnson. The soldiers who pass through these gates, whether active duty, National Guard, or reserve, emerge with lessons they carry with them for the rest of their lives. They are transformed. They are forged and honed as warriors. They go forth with the spirit of Sergeant William Henry Johnson and all who upheld their oath in courage and honor. These are the values of the United States Army. These are the values we are proud to defend. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our host for today's ceremony, the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Johnson Commanding General, Brigadier General David W. Gardner.
All right, we've all been waiting a long time to hear that. Fort Johnson. First of all, I do want to say to everyone on the field, no one's going to love you any less if you shake your legs out a little bit, readjust yourselves. It's hot out there. The remarks are long. The ceremony's long. You may not have noticed because I did it subtly, but after we slammed that hammer down on the anvil, it was my pleasure to present the first JRTC and Fort Johnson Commanding General's coin to Command Sergeant Major David P. Hansen, responsible for this ceremony. Great job, Sergeant Major. 36th Division Band, great job. And so, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, let me be the first to welcome you to the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Johnson. We are proud to serve at this great installation, which boasts such a rich history. The home of the Army's premier combat training center and the home of heroes is now named after a soldier who fully embodied the warrior spirit, and we are deeply honored to bear his name. In attendance today at our ceremony, we have some very special guests. And General Hokanson, Kelly Hokanson, thanks for being here and thanks for those great remarks. Command Sergeant Major Lewis Wilson and his wife Teresa, the former Command Sergeant Major of the New York National Guard, Command Sergeant Major Wilson accepted the Medal of Honor on Sergeant Johnson's behalf in 2015. We have families that advocated for what were too many years so that Sergeant Johnson would be recognized for his bravery and sacrifice. We've got the Howe family with us. We've got the Johnson family with us. It's interesting to note that we're not just celebrating history 105 years ago, but a history of service that has spanned 105 years in those two families, from World War I to the Tuskegee Airmen, to the Vietnam War, and to the streets of Fallujah. Please give them a round of applause. And as was mentioned, we have 3 members of the Naming Commission. That makes this place special. Admiral retired Michelle Howard, Lieutenant General Thomas Bostick, retired, and Mr. Jerry Buchanan. Your presence here today makes this ceremony even more special and meaningful. Fort Polk and its land in the heart of Louisiana has always had a special place in the history of America. Fort Polk has always been needed by America. For over 80 years, we have trained millions of America's soldiers, and that legacy will continue as Fort Johnson. Most of you are aware that Camp Polk was first established on the eve of World War II in the fall of 1941. 350,000 soldiers fought the greatest practice battle in U.S. history. The linked and nearly continuous mock battles of what became known as the Louisiana Maneuvers had one purpose: to prepare America's soldiers for the World War that had begun in Europe and was threatening to spread around the globe. And so, on January 10th, 1941, Camp Polk was born. In 1941, General George C. Marshall spoke some words that have become our touchstone ever since. He said while testifying to Congress, "Senator, I want the mistakes made down in Louisiana, not over in Europe." And oh my, what words could be more true today and more relevant? At the end of World War II, the victorious U.S. Army rapidly began to downsize, and by 1946, Camp Polk was designated a medical training center, and only a skeleton force remained. Finally, in December of 1946, military officials declared Camp Polk inactive, and the previously bustling barracks and facilities went quiet. But when the nation called again, Camp Polk answered in June of 1950. North Korean soldiers surging across the 38th parallel to invade South Korea. And so that August, the 45th Infantry Division, Oklahoma National Guard, there's our deep roots again, reported for duty at Camp Polk. And we shook off the dust accumulated from nearly 4 years of inactivity and once again teamed with soldiers preparing for war. Camp Polk closed again in 1954. However, shortly after closing the base, the Army recognized a new threat from an intensifying Cold War. And with the world once again on the brink of war, the Army searched for a place to conduct large-scale maneuvers. And so in 1955, Camp Polk became Fort Polk and reopened in preparation for Operation Sagebrush. In a familiar cycle, by the late 1950s, the Army downsized, and in the June of 1959, we shut down completely, but not for long. With the growing Berlin crisis in 1961, the 49th Armored Division arrived at Fort Polk for training, and in June of 1962, the installation became an official training center, its mission to provide basic training for individual soldiers, many of them draftees. The number of soldiers who trained at Fort Polk then grew in correlation with the increased Army presence in Southeast Asia. Training American soldiers how to fight in difficult jungle conditions became our top priority. And again, Fort Polk's environment fit the bill. And so Tigerland was born. More than 1 million soldiers trained at Fort Polk for service in the Vietnam War. And by 1969, Fort Polk had dispatched more soldiers to Vietnam than any other military post in this nation. We underwent major changes as the Vietnam War ended. By 1974, basic training for individual soldiers tapered off, but the post took on a new role in housing the storied 5th Infantry Division mechanized. So who says this place is only for light infantry? In 1991, we prepared for war in the deserts of Iraq. We dispatched 9 support groups totaling 8,000 soldiers to train for the Gulf War. And as you all know, 30 years ago, in 1993, the Joint Readiness Training Center moved from Fort Chaffee, Arkansas to Fort Polk, thus beginning the installation's modern and even more legendary role as the Army's premier training center. At this very moment, Fort Johnson is training America's soldiers to fight and win our nation's wars. On our base and in the box today is the 44th Infantry Brigade and soldiers from 16 states, alongside the Belize Defense Force, a state partner for the state of Louisiana. The 44th Brigade is part of the famous 42nd Infantry Division, first named the Rainbow Division because it encompassed soldiers from all 48 states during the First World War. Today, the 42nd is New York National Guard, just like Sergeant William Henry Johnson. And he would be incredibly proud of his brothers and sisters who have been training here for the past 3 weeks. Our motto at Fort Polk has been, and our motto at Fort Johnson will forever be, forging the warrior spirit. Many of you hear it at countless ceremonies and events, but what does it really mean? At the heart of the warrior spirit lies courage, the unwavering bravery to face danger head on, to stand firm in the face of diversity, and to protect the freedoms we hold dear. But courage is above all the discipline to tame one's fear. The warrior spirit demands discipline, a commitment to rigorous training, the adherence to high standards, and the mastery of one's craft. Adaptability is an essential aspect of the warrior spirit, and we recognize the battlefield is ever evolving, and we must prepare to face new challenges and adapt our tactics to prevail. Above all, the warrior spirit is fueled by a deep sense of purpose, a commitment to a cause greater than oneself. As Army soldiers, we dedicate ourselves to the defense of freedom, to the protection of our nation, and to the well-being of our fellow soldiers and citizens. This sense of purpose drives every action we take, giving us the strength and resolve to persevere, even when the mission appears too difficult. If Sergeant William Henry Johnson doesn't exemplify the warrior spirit in its purest form, then I don't know who does. Sergeant Johnson was a 26-year-old, 5'4", 130-pound soldier, and was a member of the all-black New York National Guard's 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, who, by the way, are defending this nation deployed overseas as we sit here today. Why did Teddy Roosevelt call Sergeant Johnson one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in World War I? On Tuesday, 14 May 1918,
William Henry Johnson stood sentry at the foremost redoubt on the flank of a forward trench in the Argonne Forest. Johnson's presence at that position was improbable. Most American soldiers were yet to arrive in Europe, as the nation struggled through the logistics of training, equipping, and deploying an army of 4 million volunteers and draftees. But by enlisting in a segregated army, shipping out months earlier than most U.S. soldiers, and being attached to an Allied force, Johnson and his fellow sentry were black Americans wearing French uniforms at the tip of the spear in the final spring of World War I, facing down the Germans. His actions began around 2 o'clock in the morning when a German raiding party suddenly attacked his position. Sent to cause chaos and capture or kill as many of the sleeping soldiers as possible, the German attack was unexpected and ferocious. Johnson and his fellow sentry had barely heard wires being cut when enemy grenades fell into their trench, incapacitating Johnson's comrade and wounding Johnson himself. Facing a fierce enemy, wounded and without support, Johnson could have surrendered, but chose to fight, sounding the alarm before single-handedly facing the enemy. Johnson threw grenades until his supply was exhausted. When he ran out of grenades, Johnson fired his rifle until he was out of ammunition. When his bullets ran out, he charged the enemy, swinging his rifle as a club. And when he observed 2 Germans about to carry his wounded comrade away for interrogation, Johnson abandoned his rifle and instead drew his bolo knife, fighting off the raiders at close quarters and pushing them back from the position. Ultimately, Johnson single-handedly killed at least 4 Germans and wounded approximately 24 more. Despite being outnumbered and sustaining 21 separate wounds in hand-to-hand combat, he had saved his comrade, sounded the alarm, and secured his unit's safety and position. He became the United States' first hero of the Great War, immediately receiving the French Croix de Guerre for his actions, the first American soldier ever to receive that award. Johnson was an icon at the home front, and his story motivated many African Americans to support the war effort. Serving with his unit through many subsequent battles, he became known as Black Death and was paraded through New York City when he returned. But despite the accolades, Sergeant William Henry Johnson was never recognized as an American veteran. He never received the care for his wounds or any veterans' benefits such as those we take for granted today. Unable to effectively work because of his wounds, Sergeant Johnson died of them far too young. Through the tireless efforts of Americans that knew Sergeant Johnson deserved better, he was finally awarded the Purple Heart in 1996, the Distinguished Service Cross in 2002, and the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2015. Now, deservedly, he rests among our other heroes buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The warrior spirit that burned within Sergeant William Henry Johnson now inspires generations of soldiers, soldiers that will now call JRTC and Fort Johnson home, and soldiers that will continue to come here from all over the nation and all over the world to train. May we all continue to forge the warrior spirit within ourselves, honoring the sacrifices of heroes like Henry Johnson. Airborne all the way, thank you for joining us at the Home of Heroes.
At this time, the Salute Battery OIC First Lieutenant Grugian and NCOIC Sergeant First Class Clifford will present a ceremonial casing to Command Sergeant Major Retired Wilson on behalf of Brigadier General David Gardner, Command Sergeant Major David Hanson, and all soldiers, families, and civilians on Fort Johnson, thanking him for his participation in today's historical event. A ceremonial casing inscribed as the last artillery round fired at Fort Polk, Louisiana, 13 June 2023, will be placed in the Fort Johnson Museum. A ceremonial casing inscribed as the first artillery round fired at Fort Johnson, Louisiana, 13 June 2023, will be placed in the Joint Readiness Training Center and Fort Johnson Headquarters building. Ceremonial casings commemorating today's ceremony will also be placed in the National Guard Bureau Headquarters in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and the New York National Guard Headquarters in Albany, New York. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the playing of the Army song and retiring of the colors.
Unit, attention! Sir, request permission to retire the colors. Retire the colors. Sir, Major, retire the colors. Sir, this concludes today's ceremony. Fantastic job. Take charge of the unit.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's ceremony. On behalf of Brigadier General David Gardner, thank you all for attending this historical event. Once again, welcome to Fort Johnson and have a great